appear before you, this time to resist Ukraine's case on MH17. We have seen that even on Ukraine's version of the facts, it cannot demonstrate terrorist financing as a matter of law. But in any event, I submit to you now that Ukraine cannot prove its version of the facts on the materials that it has chosen to present. Now, we know that according to Ukraine, Russia sent a Buk-Tila unit into Ukraine manned by Russian soldiers, and that Buk-Tila supposedly shot down MH17, and then the Tila returned to Russia with its crew. I say again, Russia absolutely rejects that allegation. It did not happen. And so we must look very carefully at Ukraine's purported proof. It should go without saying that a party alleging an offence of this kind must prove it with proper evidence. In a criminal case, the prosecutor must prove the provenance of that evidence. It must be tracked back to the actus reus of the offence charged. At the same time, some kinds of evidence must be treated with very great caution. Digital evidence is open to manipulation, and because of that, international tribunals have been consistent in rejecting videos and intercepts with no provenance, no original data, and no human corroboration of authenticity. Please see slide 2. We refer to some decisions of the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and you see the quotes. Factors such as authenticity and proof of authorship will naturally assume the greatest importance in the trial chamber's assessment of the weight to be attached. In Prosecutor and Ptolemyer, the tribunal admitted evidence of intercepts, but only after the intercept operators testified to describe the procedures that were followed in producing the intercepts. We have nothing like that from Ukraine. At slide 3, we refer to Prosecutor Renzaho. Again there, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda refused to admit audio evidence due to the lack of information about the recording and its provenance. And that was despite 4 witnesses claiming to identify the accused's voice. Point is, voices can be faked. And then we have case number 1 from the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia. Video footage was excluded in part because verification of the reliability of the footage, a precondition for its use as evidence, is unlikely to be obtained within a reasonable time. Evidence is not accepted without proof of provenance, and that especially applies to digital evidence. Now a preliminary point. In Ukraine's opening submissions, my learned friends for Ukraine said that Russia could not contest Ukraine's case on the facts because it hadn't done so before. That is not correct. Russia has contested all of Ukraine's case in open pleadings in the European Court of Human Rights and in this case. In its pleadings here, it has refused to accept Ukraine's digital material in the form of the intercepts from Ukraine's security service, the SBU. Ukraine and indeed the Netherlands have been fully aware of Russia's objections to lack of provenance for years. They were also being examined in Strasbourg. But in the events that have happened, there can be no resolution there because Russia has left the Council of Europe. Under Article 26(4), that is an end of things. It is a matter of regret for Russia that the European Court of Human Rights has purported to continue with that case to a purported decision on admissibility. But it is even more regrettable that the admissibility decision does not even summarize, let alone address, many of the points that I shall now draw to your attention. For present purposes, the points exist, and they are or should be public on Russia's pleadings in Strasbourg, and I'm sure they will be in Russia's rejoinder here. Ukraine has always had the burden of proving its case in all relevant tribunals, and it was for Ukraine to choose how to do that. And we respectfully submit It can't do that without addressing obvious identified deficiencies in its materials. Just as an example, it cannot rely on social media and intercepts to track a supposed Russian buck from Russia into Ukraine and back again without providing original digital files. You cannot put forward a digital case without even providing the digital files. And there's a broader concern here. There are real points that have not been considered by any court. Not in the Hague Court, not in the European Court of Human Rights, which on any view had only reached the admissibility stage. Justice requires that all of us as professionals, including the court, look carefully at Ukraine's purported evidence and the problems with it. This is not a case for procedural games. Now, Ukraine relies on the work of the Dutch Safety Board to prove that MH17 was destroyed by a Buck missile with a 9N314 warhead. Just in parenthesis, Russia has not agreed to resolution of facts by the Dutch Safety Board, so we must look at the evidence. I start with the DSB's conclusions that a Russian Buck missile exploded outside the port side of the cockpit of MH17. There are real problems with the DSB's work. Number one, slide 6, please. Triangulation. Slide 6 shows how the DSB supposedly proved explosion of a buck on the port side of the cockpit by triangulating sound from the explosion to 4 different microphones in the cockpit. And the difference in time allows calculation of the point of the explosion. That was the theory. The origin of the sound of the explosion is shown outside and slightly above the port side of the cockpit. Unfortunately for the DSB and Ukraine, Russia's experts demonstrated in Strasbourg and here that this is a totally impossible analysis because of basic physics, and they are experts of the highest distinction. Number one, it was impossible to triangulate using sound because there is no sound within tens of meters of an explosion. What there is a shockwave that moves very much faster than sound, destroying structure as it proceeds. What there also is random shrapnel, which again moves at many times the speed of sound, and again it destroys things as it goes. That's the point of it. Quite obviously, therefore, any sound at any of the microphones in the cockpit would come from local destruction of the aircraft as a result of the shockwave and random shrapnel. It's impossible to do straight line triangulation assuming sound. Consider what that means. It means that whilst the DSB produced a glossy report, which is ostensibly convincing for a layperson, that triangulation was fiction. And this is key analysis relied on supposedly to prove that a Russian missile exploded outside the cockpit. Secondly, slide 8, bow ties. In order for the DSB and indeed Ukraine to implicate Russia, they have to show that it was a missile with a 9N314M warhead, because that's the kind of missile in use by Russia that contains bow ties. And here you see the bow ties. They're vertical, and between them are smaller square elements. Now, the point is, only this missile could be the Russian one. An older missile without bow ties may well have come from Ukraine, and you've seen the point that on the Dutch military intelligence document, it was a Ukrainian buck that was closest to MH17. Now, the DSB made use of purported bow ties, but let's look at their provenance. The story begins with Mr. Ackermans, a journalist at RTL. After bow ties became an issue in the DSB investigation, Mr. Ackermans claimed to have found one. RTL produced a video of the find. We've got it at slides 11 and 12. Here is Mr. Ackerman's. Next slide. There is the bow tie lying on top of wreckage of MH17, very conveniently. But, see slide 13, that piece of wreckage landed the other way up. So that bow tie could not possibly have been discovered sitting on the other side of that piece of wreckage. Now, before this upside-down problem was discovered, the DSB used the Ackerman's bow tie to persuade Almaz Antey, the Russian manufacturer of the missile, that it must have been an N314M with bow ties. And Mr. Malashevsky, a specialist there, made a presentation that cited the Ackerman's bow tie front and center. You've got it on slide 14. Almaz, maybe naively, took for granted what was said about provenance of physical evidence. And you've got Mr. Malashevsky's witness statement in the rejoinder at Annex 369. Now, when the DSB encountered the upside-down problem, they quietly stopped relying on this bow tie. But there is no hint of any investigation by the DSB, the Dutch police, the JIT, or anybody else into how and why that false bow tie was sought to be inserted into the DSB's work. Any proper investigation would have worried immediately that somebody had the animus of trying to blame Russia. There was no such concern at the DSB. Instead, it began to discover its own bow ties. In around July 2015, the DSB claimed to have found them in the bodies of the crew of the aircraft and in the cockpit, slide 15. But Russia pointed out two problems. First, the bow ties were supposedly found long after the funerals of the crew. We've given references to coverage of those. Ukraine has not answered this point. There is nothing from the DSB. The argument would have to be that bow ties were found earlier and only examined later. But given the total focus on missiles, proof of a Russian missile, and anything significant, it is absurd to suggest that items, fragments, that didn't look like parts of the aeroplane would be left for later. It doesn't help that between the draft DSB report and the final report, the DSB was thoroughly confused about where the bow ties came from. The fragments are attributed to different bodies. We have another bow tie fragment supposedly discovered in the cockpit, but different locations were given for it. You see on that the witness statement of Mr. Malashevsky and the schedule from Almaz. Now, there was a further problem with this cockpit fragment. We have that at slide 18. Scientific analysis showed that after the explosion of the warhead, the heavy bow ties would lose mass. But there was a certain minimum mass. And the Netherlands National Aerospace Laboratory calculated that. It was 5.67 grams. The NLR weighed this very piece and discovered that it was 5.5 grams, and so the conclusion followed that it did not qualify as a potential bow tie. The DSB ignored that. It proceeded to make this bow tie its star bow tie, even though the mass was inadequate. And the solution to the mass problem was extraordinary. This same fragment was falsely recorded in the final DSB report as having a greater mass. 5.5 grams, measured by the National Aerospace Laboratory, became 6.1 grams, a little over that laboratory's minimum. There has been no explanation whatsoever as to why the DSB falsely recorded this key piece of evidence. Next, problems with penetration damage. The DSB relied on penetration damage to the port side of the cockpit. You see that overall there, and you see lots of pieces of the port side fuselage at the cockpit. But where did these pieces come from? Mr. Bukurcu, an OSCE observer, was very concerned about what happened to the cockpit on the ground. We see that from slide 23. We've set out what he said. In summary, he said, at first the cockpit was very much intact, then it was spread out, and men with uniforms were hacking at it with power saws. See now slide 24. This shows that the men with power saws were members of Ukraine's special emergency services, state emergency services, I'm sorry, the SES. See also slide 25. This shows that by the time the cockpit wreckage was taken away, all of the port side of the cockpit was missing. Note some chronology on that. See slide 26. The last physical evidence was collected between April and May 2015. Now let's see how the DSB recorded the relevant pieces. Slide 27. In the draft DSB report, July 2015, we have one black piece. Now see slide 28. The final DSB report appeared in October 25, and by this stage the black pieces have multiplied. Now it's critical to notice that black in their scheme means no known provenance. So, on the face of it, we have a history of interference with critically important wreckage and no proof of provenance. It's very odd that there is no proof of provenance, given that Mr. Bukurcu, the OSCE observer, said that the cockpit was initially intact before mysterious men hacked at it with power tools. Those men from Ukraine's emergency services. But at any rate, this is evidence without provenance, which has been interfered with by Ukraine, and it's not proper evidence in this case. This point has been live for a long time. It's never been dealt with by Ukraine. They just put forward the DSB report as if that is dogma on everything. There was another problem. Almaz-Antey did an experiment where they replicated a Buck M1 explosion with the bow tie warhead next to a similar aeroplane, slide 30. Here, with a bow tie warhead in the position claimed by the DSB, we see a rash of bow tie holes. There were no bow tie holes on these mysterious pieces said to represent the port side of the cockpit in the DSB report. Almaz-Antey concluded that the missile could not have been a modern missile with a bow tie warhead, given the absence of bow tie holes. If there were a missile, it would need to be an older one from Soviet times, which only had the small square shrapnel and not the larger bow ties. See on that Russia's Rejoinder, Annex 1, page 128. Now that suggests a Ukrainian missile. And this affects other key points, because shrapnel damage can give an indication of the orientation of the missile relative to the aircraft when it explodes. And that allows calculation of the area where the missile was launched from. And the latest work from Almaz shows that the DSB's assessment of the firing position does not work. See slide 31 and the evidence referred to there. Next problem, explosive traces. The DSB claimed to have done swab tests for explosives, but the draft report says that 500 swab tests were done on pieces of aeroplane wreckage and also on missile pieces. In parenthesis, the missile pieces emerged with no provenance at all very late in the day. In the final report, that 500 becomes 126. with no explanation. And it makes no sense, because please imagine you are doing a proper scientific forensic investigation looking into an incident like this. How can you possibly lose that many swabs? In the conclusions of the final DSB report, it was said at page 255 that the missile parts had traces of a type of explosive, RDX, that is similar to the traces found on the wreckage of the aeroplane. But even within the DSB report, just looking at that, it's not correct. The DSB draft report in July 2015 said at paragraph 2.16.3, 500 swabs were taken, positive results were recorded on the wreckage of the airplane for RDX and TNT. The final report said 126 swab samples, and it said that positive results were recorded for RDX, TNT, and PETN on the aeroplane parts, whereas only RDX was found on the missile part. So that's all very odd. First, there was reluctance between the two reports to mention PETN, and we don't know how extensive those swab results for PETN were. We do know it's not a mistake, because in the Dutch prosecutor's prosecution, he presented one page of the swab results, and it shows that the aeroplane parts bore traces of PETN and its degradation products. And you've got that page of results at slide 35, PETN, you see up at the top. The significance is this: PETN is not RDX. It's the terrorist explosive of choice when it comes to blowing up airliners. It was used by Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab, the underwear bomber. There has been no explanation why the DSB has been inconsistent about the number of swab tests for explosives. There's no explanation why it did not mention PETN in the draft report, and there is no discussion of the potential significance of PETN. In practical effect, the DSB only explored a case against Russia, and that case was based on non-existent bow ties and wreckage without provenance. The second part of Ukraine's case against Russia relies on the alleged tracking of a buck TILA from Russia and back again using social media. Ukraine relies on a Dutch national police report, Bellingcat, a supposed collective of citizen journalists, and the work of the Joint Investigation Team, the JIT, and Russia was not a member of that. Again, Russia has not agreed to delegate fact-finding to any of those. Now, these digital files were supposedly found on the internet or provided by Ukraine's security service, the SBU, but there's no proper evidence of provenance or authenticity. And the pictures supposedly show the buck unit at various points on the route. We can see that from the Dutch National Police report and the pictures showing it stopped at various points. All of these are digital media files, and that digital media is malleable. Russia has asked for the original files for years now. They have not been produced by either the Ukraine or the Netherlands. And it's not just Russia that thought they were important. Please look at slides 41 to 44. 41 is a document from the Australian Federal Police Forensic Department. They wanted the original files to do their own analysis. And you can see their conclusion at slide 45. This is in 2015. Australia is a member of the JIT, and the Australian Federal Police are not provided with original files. What they were provided with was clearly manipulated. Next, the Snizny video. One of the most disturbing parts of Ukraine's evidence concerns the Snizny video, showing a buck unit that supposedly moves up a hill or towards a hill near Snizny to its firing position, and it said that it shot down MH17 from there. Again, Ukraine has provided no original data file, and the provenance is very strange. Elliot Higgins is supposed to have found it on a social media account. He founded Bellingcat about 3 days before MH17 was destroyed. Mr. Higgins has said that he found the video on YouTube on the 17th of July, the day of destruction of the aeroplane, but the original posting was taken down. No matter, says Mr. Higgins, he had taken a copy of it, and he says that he re-uploaded it onto YouTube the same day. Fortunately for justice, the version first uploaded was preserved on an automated web service, and Russia's experts were able to study it, and their report is Rejoinder Annex 362. Now comes an extraordinary revelation. The first version of the Snizny video was encoded on the 16th of July 2014, the day before MH17 was destroyed. And you have that at slides 47 to 8. That is significant because, as we see slide 49, the date of uploading onto YouTube gives the encoding date, even if the video is only published and released for public view later. And hence, one can have the date of 17 on the published version when you look at YouTube, but when you see the metadata of the original file, the encoding was on the 16th. This absolutely shows that the video existed before MH17 was destroyed, and it absolutely shows that it cannot prove a Russian buck moving to an alleged firing position. Quite separately, there are lots of problems with the video. I'm going to take those very shortly because time is short, but there's a hard line at the top of the video. Sorry, first of all, on this slide 50, one of the bushes, vegetation, develops a hard vertical line as the buck goes by, maybe indicating the edge of a superimposed layer of activity where the buck moves. And then slides 51, 52, there's a hard line across the video just before the hill, and the buck stops precisely there. In fact, the buck stops with the propagandists who developed this kind of thing. We'll come to that later. But the buck stops there, and the reason is that the forger did not have a view of the buck giving its top side in order to take it up the hill. There are also lots of technical issues, problems with the video listed at slide 53. Please read that. Note that later versions of this video were better in quality than the first, better than the original. That does not happen with genuine evidence. Now, evidently the JIT was happy to rely on this video, which has all the hallmarks of an information operation. The JIT said there were checks on everything digital, but obviously there were none. Otherwise, all of these points would have been seen and openly and fairly addressed. As to provenance, the JIT at best had a secondary copy put up by Mr. Higgins, but that doesn't authenticate the original video. And more generally, it was wrong for the JIT to accept anything from Mr. Higgins or Bellingcat without answers to some very obvious questions. For example, who exactly is Mr. Higgins? Does he have any relevant expertise? How did he, in his personal career, suddenly move from unemployment to expert blogger on chemical weapons in the Syria conflict? Then come some really serious questions. Why was Bellingcat listed as a partner organization in the Integrity Initiative? See slide 55. The Integrity Initiative seems to be a platform for information operations that was secretly funded by the British government. You see that on slide 56 and slide 57. The funding went through the Institute for Statecraft, which is an opaque Scottish charity. It's difficult to find who's behind it. And its registered office, I'll show you that at slide 58, was a derelict factory in Scotland. The Institute for Statecraft was run by one Christopher Donnelly. Slides 59 and 60, you see his career. Mr. Donnelly, on the face of it, was Special Advisor for Central and Eastern European Affairs for 4 NATO Secretary Generals. Bellingcat was also involved in other proposals for information projects, like the Zinc Consortium at slide 61. You see Bellingcat bottom left, next to media diversity, then the Digital Forensics Lab, which is Atlantic Council, and that is adjacent to the rump of the bull. Now, another person involved in this Zinc project was Gordon Macmillan. We have his CV also. He was an executive of Twitter, but he was also a reservist in the British Army's 77 Brigade. See that at slides 62 to 63. The 77 Brigade is the British Army propaganda unit. Slide 64. Now, any proper investigation looking at matters objectively might have been skeptical about the provenance of that video, and they might have looked at points like that. Not any of the august institutions on which Ukraine relies as evidence, without providing any of the underlying digital material. Finally, let's look quickly at intercepts. These supposedly show rebels calling for air support, the sending of a Russian Buk Tilar and crew, and surprise when it was realized that a civil plane had been hit. The first and most important intercepts were published by the SBU on the 17th of August 2014, but you see slide 66. Again, this compendium was encoded the day before MH17 was shot down, on the 16th. Bellingcat admit that, but they try to say, oh, there was a technical hitch with all MP4 files because of a problem with the standard used to encode them. Russia's experts, who again are very expert indeed, have rejected that for a list of technical reasons, which you have in Russia's rejoinder at Annex 362. But there's a more prosaic point. This would have led to wrong dates on millions of MP4s for years and years and years all around the world. That is absurd, and nowhere has Ukraine sought to prove Bellingcat's technical hitch. Again, this is a point that has been out there. Bellingcat is content to address it in some internet article, but Ukraine doesn't present that as evidence, because had it done so, it need only be presented to be seen as ridiculous. A further point. One of the conversations was clearly manipulated by Ukraine's security service, the SBU. See slide 67. It was manufactured from an earlier intercept. The call involved Mr. Besler, and the conversation, the earlier conversation, much before MH17, was about the shooting down of a Sukhoi aeroplane. The SBU removed the reference to Sukhoi and presented this as relating to the shooting down of MH17. Now, Mr. Besler sued Bellingcat in Russia for implicating him in the destruction of MH17. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, you would be forgiven for not noticing that, because curiously it's not something that's as featured in the Western press. Bellingcat was fully represented in those proceedings in Russia. It chose not to offer any defense, and damages were awarded. And in Strasbourg, Russia also presented forensic expert evidence from a Malaysian expert, Mr. Rosen, who showed all kinds of indications of manipulation, slide 69. None of that has been addressed. Now, all of this is problematic when one takes into account also the radar evidence. Slide 71. If a buck had been launched near Snizhny, it would have been seen in profile on 3 sweeps of the Ust-Donetsk radar. According to Almaz-Anti, that means there's a 99% probability that it would have been seen. It follows there's a 99% probability that no buck was launched near Snizhny. Now, I'm not going to go through it again, but that was the conclusion, if you look at the end of the English translation of the Dutch military intelligence document. There were no bucks in range. Now, I have pointed out what are obvious defects in the way that Ukraine has sought to prove its case. You cannot attempt to prove a criminal case without showing provenance of the evidence, and that goes for physical evidence. You cannot purport to prove it a digital case without providing the digital files. That should be an end of it. But of course, some people say, when points like this emerge, oh, come on, surely there could not be a conspiracy as big as this. But actually there could. At slides 85 to 87, you've got some top secret documents from the Five Eyes military alliance. They were released by Edward Snowden and featured in the press. And the biggest Snowden revelation was not that the Five Eyes countries listened to everybody's phones. It was the way they create fake material on social media, and you see the relevant social media identified: Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Flickr. Then, next slide, they take it up from social media via blogging into the mainstream news. You recall that Mr. Higgins emerged as a famous blogger on the Syria conflict, and he has mediated much of the material, including the Snizhny video, from totally unknown source into what he would like to present as the accepted narrative on MH17. Next slide, you see the purposes of all of this, again in Five Eyes training documents, and you see they include a false flag operation. Now, in our written submissions, which I respectfully urge you to read, we drew attention to these documents in the Georgia v. Russia case, where it was said that Russia launched an Iskander missile at the town square in Georgia, in Gori. And an expert British colonel was called. It was put to him that that case relied entirely on videos that were defective and bits of alleged shrapnel, and it was put to him that this could be a digital confection. He said, "It is a contemporary flaw, in my view, of what happens. Yes, it's also used to great effect, I might say." Now, the short point for today is Ukraine has not proved its case. But the deeper point is, no tribunal has looked at these matters. The DSB, JIT, police in the Netherlands have not done so. It would be entirely wrong to allow this situation to be used to great effect by Ukraine. Madam President, those are my submissions. I hand over to Mr. Udovichenko, who will deal with some other terrorist alleged attacks.
I thank Mr. Swainston, and I now invite Mr. Kirill Udovichenko to address the court. You have the floor.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, it is an honor for me to appear before you on behalf of the Russian Federation. My task today is to address the substance of Ukraine's claims concerning shelling, bombing, and killing incidents. As tragic as some of these events are, there is no way to find that these are acts of terrorism, the funding of which would be prohibited by ICSFT. Rather, they are unfortunate episodes of an armed conflict and concurrent civil strife in Ukraine. As I shall explain, Ukraine's failure to properly contextualize the incidents in question is fatal for its claims. Let us first deal with the shelling incidents. Ukraine raises 4 isolated episodes that took place in Donbass over a period of 3 years, between 2015 and 2017, near Volnovakha, Mariupol, Kramatorsk, and Avdiivka. These places were among many towns affected by military conflict in eastern Ukraine. Mr. Kuzmin explained earlier today that this conflict emerged when Ukraine started heavy military operation known as the ATO against the people of Donbass. Yet on Tuesday, Ukraine pursued a well-known media strategy of labeling its military adversaries as terrorists, and suggested that their ultimate goal is spreading terror against civilians. This Ukrainian narrative can only succeed with those unfamiliar with the inherent horror of any armed conflict. We invite the Court to look into the incidents beyond the narrow black and white concepts advanced by Ukraine. The acts in question did not constitute acts of terrorism within the meaning of Article 2.1b of the ICSFT for the following reasons. First, the persons involved targeted Ukrainian military objects. Second, there is no proof that there was an intent to cause damage to civilians. Third, the civilian casualties that occurred were largely caused by Ukraine's own conduct. Fourth, the evidence showed that the republics attempted to minimize collateral damage during the armed conflict. And finally, Ukraine's case is built on unreliable evidence. Let us first look into what their targets of the shelling were. Although there is no compelling evidence that the attacks were actually carried out by the republics, in each case, the shelling did aim specifically at military target. In Volnovakha, the attack targeted a roadblock. 2 days ago, Ukraine repeatedly called it a civic checkpoint. Well, let us have a look at it. Would you call that a civilian object? Certainly not. The roadblock had armed personnel, armored vehicles, fortifications, firing positions, and a large net of trenches. Well, in fact, Ukraine's own official called this roadblock a military installation. And Ukraine's own legislation considers such roadblocks to be military objects that have both defensive and offensive functions. The personnel deployed at the roadblock was from Kiev 2 Battalion of Ukrainian Armed Forces. Ukraine has called this battalion quote, police patrol unit that assisted the border guard. But it is difficult to see how soldiers armed with heavy machine guns, grenade launchers, and heavy armored vehicles could be associated with a police force. They are not. In fact, as demonstrated by General Samolenkov, Kiev 2 played a crucial role in Ukrainian armed forces offense against the town of Dokuchaevsk. Ukraine puts much emphasis on that a civil bus has been hit during the attack. But the vehicle was inside the roadblock when the shells hit the territory of the installation. General Samolenkov's expert witness shows that the bus would therefore have been an inevitable collateral in case of any assault against the military facility. In Mariupol, the attacks aimed at Ukraine's defensive positions, a set of trenches and military checkpoints on the city border. Clearly, a military fortification. Even Ukrainian authorities unanimously confirmed that the shelling targeted military objects. In Kramatorsk, as Ukraine's own expert agreed, the attack was aimed against the ATO command headquarters and military vehicles at Kramatorsk airfield. The attack destroyed multiple Air Force units, MLRS launchers, and ammunition silos. In Avdiivka, Ukraine again agrees that the attacks hit legitimate targets, such as Ukrainian armed forces combat positions, artillery fire positions, supply routes, places for allocation troops and armored vehicles. Remarkably, the Ukrainian forces chose to station those right inside the residential areas or behind the residential buildings. In short, all 4 attacks had legitimate military targets. Professor Sien Hoi and Mr. Svensson have explained that in the context of an armed conflict, it is the rules of IHL that govern the conduct of combatants. The ICSFT does not, and indeed cannot, criminalize conduct that is lawful under the IHL. I then turn to my second and closely connected point. The lack of intent to cause death or serious body injury to a civilian within the meaning of Article 2.1b of the ICSFT. Since it cannot prove a specific terrorist intent, Ukraine had to come up with a creative but untenable theory. It argues that indiscriminate weapons used in the attacks and therefore indirect intent to harm civilians could be inferred from this. First, Mr. Svensson has already explained that Article 2.1b of the ICSFT does not provide for indirect intent. Well, this should be the end of the matter. Second, the weapons that were used in the shelling incidents, MLRS BM-21 Grad and BM-30 Smerch, are not prohibited or inherently indiscriminate. They are widely used in hostilities around the world. Ukraine's own expert states that Smerch cluster munitions vote, and I quote, an ideal weapon for the attack at the Kramatorsk airfield. There are numerous reports that Ukraine used Grad, Smerch, and other artillery to shell residential areas in Donbass. In fact, just 9 days after the shelling hit the bus in Volnovakha, a similar bus in Donetsk was hit by Ukrainian forces, killing 8 civilians and injuring 13. The Human Rights Watch report documented multiple use of Grad, as well as heavy MLRS systems with cluster munitions by Ukraine to shell populated areas of the republics, including Starobeshevo, Makiivka, Ilovaisk, and Novosvetlovka. In fact, the OSCE report that during 2014 to 2017, many more civilians were killed or injured on the territory controlled by the republics than at the territory controlled by Ukraine. In other words, shelling by Ukraine forces caused many more civilian casualties than any alleged shelling by their adversaries. If one assumes, as Ukraine suggests, that indiscriminate shelling can somehow qualify as an act of terrorism, it necessarily follows that Ukraine itself engaged in such terrorism and did so on a massive scale, being the prime terrorist in the conflict. Ukraine provided what they call intercepts of communications between the Republic fighters. There is no evidence that these intercepts were genuine or complete. However, even these records evidence that precautions were taken to avoid loss or injury of civilians resulting from the attacks. The DPR closed civilian traffic near Berezhno and Volnovakha, including on the day of the roadblock was attacked. If it were the DPR who attacked the roadblock and the intent was to harm civilians, why would they want to limit civilian traffic? In Mariupol, raging shots and local observers were used to divert fire away from residential areas. There is absolutely nothing in the intercepts that show that the attacker ever intended to hit civilians or were indifferent to that. On the contrary, the intercepts related to the Mariupol shelling show that the attackers were shocked by unexpected hits on a civilian-populated area. My third point is that civilian casualties resulted from Ukraine's forces' own impermissible defensive strategy. Kiev hid its military units inside or close to civil objects, used civilian vehicles to transport troops, and refrained from evacuating civilians from the surrounded areas. This tactic was effective. Ukraine waged war on Republic's territory and had high tolerance for collateral damage, while the opposing side could not risk hitting their family members, friends, or neighbors who got separated by the front line. Ukraine knew how to properly utilize this. In Volnovakha, Ukrainian forces arranged a civil checkpoint at the same place as its military checkpoint. Ukrainian forces deliberately conducted lone searches to create waiting lines at this roadblock checkpoint. Those wishing to pass had to undergo extreme danger by having to loiter around a military target in the center of a large minefield. An explicit disregard for civilian safety inevitably led to tragic loss of innocent lives. In Mariupol, the Ukrainian forces dug their trenches and arranged defensive positions very close to the densely populated residential district called Vostochny. Despite the obvious threats to the residents, they were not evacuated or placed in shelter. In Kramatorsk, although the size of the airfield allowed otherwise, the troops and tanks were stationed as close as possible to the bordering residential area. This was again an improper intent to make NATO personnel a collateral risky target. In Avdiivka, the Ukrainian forces hid their armor behind populated residential buildings, literally at their backyard. Even though the front line passed across the city and heavy battle was waged inside its suburbs, the residents were not evacuated. Thus, we repeatedly observe a clear pattern of Ukrainian human shield tactic. My final point would be that Ukraine's case rests on totally unreliable evidence. There is absolutely no sense in what Ukraine defines as the purpose of the shelling incidents. The Minsk peaceful process could unlikely be affected by an individual case of shelling, as it occurred against the background of a bloody, full-scale armed conflict. You can see that only in the year 2014, Ukraine executed numerous attacks against civilians opposing the Maidan government in Donbass and Ukraine. Besides, Avdiivka incident happened long after the Minsk agreements were concluded. It is indicative that, according to Ukraine, it has been provoked by a US administration entering office, something that literally happened on the other side of the world. But the flaws of Ukraine's position transpire in smaller matters as well. 2 days ago, Ukraine relied on an intercept which allegedly proves that DPR commander cheered about the shelling of Vostochny district in Mariupol. However, this reaction does not have anything to do with the shelling of the city. The word Vostochny here refers not to Vostochny residential area, but to the Vostochny checkpoint, a military target which is 1.55 kilometers away from the residential district. Both the military checkpoint and the residential area are referred to as Vostochny. Another intercept, the one that Ukraine presents as its central evidence, was supposed to show that the republics intended to terrify population. This one, well, it is just a text document typed in Microsoft Word with no audio provided. Well, let alone, given the context, the speaker clearly intends to terrify opposing military personnel, not civilians. He explicitly demonstrates compassion for the latter in the last sentence. Further, the evidence provided by Ukraine suggests that at least some of the incidents were actually friendly fire. Ukraine's satellite imagery experts failed to establish any precise location whatsoever of the rocket launchers. Instead, they suggested various potential firing positions. None of them stood the challenge of basic analysis of a competing expert report. We can see that Ukraine's experts rely on a few scorched landmarks or tire trails for their calculation. However, these were captured on satellite images made long before the day of the attack, or do not appear in these images until several days after the shelling. The tire tracks that Ukraine attributes to January 15 were already there in November 2014. And on the following slide, it is relevant to the shelling that occurred on February 10, 2015. Ukraine points us to the photo on the right. It was made 17 days after the incident. However, no such tracks could be found on the photo made on 12 February 15, 2 days after the shelling. For obvious reasons, Ukraine experts choose to ignore such clear mistakes. Without this manipulation, Ukraine's case makes no sense. With it, Ukraine's case is simply a lie. The Volnovakha roadblock was at least 15 kilometers away from Republic-controlled territory. Ukraine's own evidence showcasts that it was hit by Grad rockets with spoiler rings. This allowed General Samolenkov to determine that the firing position was located approximately 10 to 12 kilometers northeast from the roadblock. Hence, the attack could not be carried out from the area controlled by the republics. Perhaps this is the matter of a friendly fire from Ukraine's own artillery. Ukraine's expert tried to rebut this by stating that there was no spoiler rings at the rockets. Without the rings, the Grad rockets would reach up to 19 kilometers. Some Republic forces might have indeed been in that area. But Ukraine caught in its own net. It concurrently submitted expert evidence showing that the rockets hitting the roadblock were in fact had spoiler rings limited the range of impact. Hence, friendly fire stands as the only plausible option. To bring charges to deliberately targeting civilian objects, Ukraine presents the strikes on the Kramatorsk airfield and the impacts on residential area of Kramatorsk as two different attacks. But Ukraine concealed all possible data on the damage done to the airfield. Otherwise, this data would have undoubtedly confirmed that the airfield and the residential area suffered damage at the same time and in course of a single shelling. The arguments of Ukraine on shelling incidents fail to make a solid and credible case. As a result, none of the shelling incidents were acts of terrorism within the meaning of Article 2.1b of the ICSFT. Madam President, members of the court, may I please delay lunch for another 10 to 15 minutes to cover bombing and killing incidents?
You may. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I now move to the alleged bombing and killing incidents that Ukraine raises in this case. We will look at each incident in turn, but before we do that, two general comments are necessary. First, same as with the shelling incidents, Ukraine wants you to ignore the context in which these events may have taken place. That context again negates allegations of terrorism. The 2014 coup d'etat in Kiev led not only to the armed conflict in Donbass, it also provoked civil strife and unrest elsewhere throughout Ukraine. Two political groups clashed: the Maidan supporters, who were mostly Ukrainian nationalists and radicals, and the Maidan opponents, who were mostly activists from Russian-speaking regions. The Maidan supporters were quick to escalate violence. They bombed, burned houses, and killed many anti-Maidan leaders. Most infamously, they burned down the House of Labor Union in Odessa and killed opposing activists who hid there. The breakout of violence was marked with radicals storming governmental buildings across the country, while weaponizing themselves with firearms captured from police offices and military warehouses. Almost simultaneously, former Member of Parliament Oleg Kalashnikov and writer Oles Buzina were murdered in Kiev in April 2015. At the very same time, a Donbas-born writer, Sergei Sukhavuk, was savagely beaten to death. None of these murders were properly investigated by Ukrainian authorities, while the believed perpetrators were condemned and sheltered. It is not surprising that the violence unleashed by the Maidan supporters led to civil violence in return. Ukraine descended to civil strife, whereas various political groups pursued their own interests. However, a civil strife like that cannot itself qualify as terrorism under the ICSFT or ICSTB. Terrorism has a clear purpose: to intimidate population or to compel a government. Otherwise, the Maidan thugs would have been the first to be prosecuted as terrorists, which of course never happened. Remarkably, in its presentation, Ukraine relies on a far smaller number of the alleged incidents than in its previous submissions. For the sake of efficiency, I will address these particular cases while leaving the written submissions to deal with the Romanian allegations. It is highly indicative that Ukraine failed to provide any credible link between the incidents and Russia. In fact, the only thing that actually ties them together is the active involvement of one particular Ukrainian agency, the Security Service of Ukraine, or the SBU. The SBU is notorious for its impermissible methods of law enforcement. The OHCHR, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch reported that since 2014, the SBU unlawfully detained, tortured, coerced confessions from political opponents. It also conducted extrajudicial executions and staged provocations. Striving on the narrative of a so-called Russian plot was an easy way for the SBU to extract usual benefits, to expand its authority and importance, to foment anti-Russian hysteria, and to promote certain politicians. The underlying incidents of bombing and killings were skillfully used to serve the purpose of anti-Russian campaign. In fact, they become so notorious that at the end were ultimately brought to the attention of the ICJ. Now it would be revealed that the incidents are no more than mystification, and those which are not lack any connection with Russia and never contained a terroristic intent in their essence. The first incident concerns bombing of Stena Pub in Kharkov in 2014. Ukraine says that a Ukrainian Kharkov partisans movement was behind the non-lethal explosion that injured several people in a pub that was used by Ukrainian ultra-right radical groups as a gathering point. After a lengthy investigation, Ukraine is able to put forward only a single piece of evidence: a court decision of the Ukrainian court based on a confession. A confession by Maria Kovtun, a 48-year-old garment worker who was accused of bombing by the SBU. The confession was coerced and given without an attorney present. Her sister gives a graphic example of how it was extracted. I saw her 4 weeks later in the jail through 2 glass panes and 2 bars, and one side of her face was just blue. I can imagine what happened to her then. While still in custody, Kovtun retracted her confession as done under torture and went on numerous hunger strikes. Same pattern applied to all Kharkov partisans who Ukraine tried to paint as terrorists. They all denied their involvement in the bombing. They said that the explosion was staged and was staged on the orders of Ukraine's interior minister, Avakov. This enabled Mr. Avakov to introduce the anti-terrorist operation regime in Kharkov, curtail human rights, and start in repressions against any suspected dissidents. Given that the bombing was carried out in a small, crowded room, it is especially fortunate that the incident turned out to be non-lethal. Whoever planted the bomb did put a lot of professionalism into avoiding casualties, much more than can be expected from a 48-year-old garment worker. Next incident is the alleged bombing of the Privat Bank office in Kharkov. Here, the evidence that the incident was staged is even more overwhelming. According to Ukraine, some military-trained bomber fired an MROA grenade launcher into the bank office. The tube of the weapon, that is the empty shell left over after the grenade has been fired, was allegedly left at the crime scene. A few observations are necessary at this stage. First, this so-called terrorist attack took place at night, when the bank was closed, and there were no people inside or in the vicinity. So even in theory, no death or injury to civilians could have occurred. Lack of terrorist intent on the part of the purported attacker is obvious. Secondly, again, according to Ukraine, the rocket did not even detonate, and in fact has been safely removed afterwards from the bank office by the SBU. Apparently, SBU also safely removed an empty launch tube, as no one has ever seen this, as no one has seen it ever since. However, Russia explosive expert explains that the attack, as it is described by Ukraine, is impossible in principle. An MROA rocket almost always detonates when it hits object of attack, or at least when someone attempts to touch it. It cannot be neutralized or removed from the site. Whereas the alleged attacker supposedly had military training, only a rookie unprofessional would fire an MROA rocket from a short distance into the second floor of the building. The rocket is not fit for such a close target. It would burst immediately and hurt the attacker. Not a single person was harmed, and property damage was minimum. This surrounding circumstances once again point towards the incident being staged by the SBU. In any event, it entirely lacks the necessary prerequisites to be qualified as an offense under the ICSTB or ICSFT. It also lacks connection to Russia. Ukraine attempts to cure this by arguing that the attack was performed by a uniquely Russian-produced weapon, the MROA Borodach grenade launcher. This connection is clearly far-stretched. There is a very similar, almost identical weapon in service with the Ukrainian armed forces, the Shmel grenade launcher. Both weapons operate under the same principles, being in fact developed with the same Soviet technology. There is no physical evidence to suggest that the alleged bombing was made using specifically Borodach and not Shmel. In fact, even the testimony of the alleged perpetrator, as supplied by Ukraine, only mentions Shmel and never Borodach. Ukraine puts a lot of emphasis on the tube of the grenade launcher purportedly found at the scene of the incident, but such tube was never produced. It exists only in the reports of the SBU. Anyway, such shells can be freely obtained in Ukraine, as they are no longer dangerous weapons, but simply harmless pieces of metal. It could easily be purchased from different Ukrainian or Russian marketplaces selling military souvenirs, which you can see. Next, it is the bombing at the Unity rally in Kharkov. Ukraine again relies as evidence on coerced confessions of Viktor Titushsky Sergei Baslyakov and Vladimir Dvornikov. However, they all retracted their confessions later as given under torture and without any attorney present. Details of coercion are again graphic. Dvornikov's multiple broken bones, in particular his ribs, as well as bruises, abrasions, and other injuries resulted from the repeated use of physical violence against him. The SBU beat these people and then subjected them to mock executions. It is graceless for Ukraine to employ such evidence in the distinguished court. We are confident that the court would not base its judgment on the confession obtained through torture. Ukraine tries to link various episodes to Russia by arguing that Russian mines were used. Again, this conclusion is far-stretched. These mines are either old Soviet-type mines or mines that are produced outside of Russia, which are in any case in service of the Ukrainian armed forces. The mines could easily be obtained by SBU as well as become available to any ATO veteran. This year, only this year, 2023, the same mine was used in the attempt to assassinate a world-known Donbass writer, Zakhar Prilepin. A pattern of SBU methods is thus consistent. Finally, Ukraine speculates on the death of several farmers in Donetsk region in 2014, including Valery Salo, and paints them, these tragic cases, as part of an alleged intimidation campaign by the DPR against local population. However, neither OHCHR nor any other bodies have ever established that any summary executions took place in that region or that Salo's death was amongst those executions. Indeed, even the otherwise doubtful report of the Human Rights Commission stresses that it is not clear that the motive behind the killing was. It could have been a common crime committed for personal reasons, for extortion, or because of the business conflict. At the same time, Ukraine's law enforcement was unstable. Many radicals were on the loose, and the crime rate was highest in the Donetsk region. For example, in the same period, a Russian photo correspondent, Andrei Stenin, and his two fellow colleagues were burned in a car in the Donetsk region. Thus, what happened to Salo was not uncommon among farmers and private entrepreneurs there. Robberies against farmers, often ending in their murder, have occurred regularly throughout Ukraine in the past and continue to occur. It is regrettable that Ukrainian authorities could not protect citizens from crime and violence. But clearly, there is no objective to blame Russia for Ukraine's own failures. No demands were made by the alleged terrorists. No statements or threats were issued. No clear purpose could have been seen through these acts. And finally, no signs of Russia's involvement. The bombing and killing incidents do not meet specific purpose to intimidate a population at large, as requested by Article 2.1b of the ICSFT. They do not rise beyond the level of the ordinary crime to qualify as terrorism. Madam President, members of the court, it is undisputed that there has been an armed conflict, a civil strife, and a crime break in Ukraine. This led to appalling loss of civilian life. However, none of these tragic events create a plausible case for terrorism or terrorism financing under the ICSFT or ICSTB. My arguments are thus concluded. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Udovichenko, whose statement brings to an end this morning's session. The court will meet again this afternoon at 3 p.m. to hear the remainder of the first round of oral argument of the Russian Federation. The sitting is adjourned.